The Outsider's Guide to Was Canberra a Mistake? My God. Well, having been born in Canberra and having been raised in Canberra and being a Canberran through and through, I'll have to turn to Rita Panahi and James Morrow to find out if my hometown was a mistake. Plus, I'll have a few opinions of my own. Rita Panahi. Canberra came about because Melbourne and Sydney famously couldn't agree on which would be the capital. There was much debate back in the day about the merits of having a separate capital city away from the centres of finance and industry. In your opinion, let's get right into it. Was Canberra a mistake?
Damn right it was a mistake. They could not make a decision, so they came up with some weak compromise, and Canberra was born because they couldn't decide between Melbourne and Sydney. I just think, how different would our country be if they, say, picked Sydney and said, this is the most populous, it's where most of the industry is, and this is where we're going to place it, or Melbourne. And that Canberra bubble, I wonder if that would exist in the form that it does if the capital was in Melbourne or Sydney, or whether that political class, media class, would be a little bit more in touch with the mainstream and what matters to them, rather than being in their own little world with their own agendas and priorities, which are often at odds with most of the Australian public.
Well, James, as I said, my parents are from Perth and they were moved to Canberra as young professionals. My mother worked in Parliament House for Menzies. My father was a public servant. They were moved from Perth as Canberra centralised and brought public servants from all across Australia, moved them to Perth in the 60s and 70s and built the city there. So I grew up in a place that was being literally built around us, and nearly everybody was a public servant or a teacher or a shopkeeper for the public servants. Now, we saw this in Washington, Brasilia are similar capitals away from the main centres of commerce. Do you think Canberra was a mistake?
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned these other cities as well. Canberra was a mistake of the first order, as are pretty much every other planned capital city around the world. And I include in that list Ankara, Brasilia, I would even say possibly Washington, D.C., except for the fact that Washington, D.C. had the good fortune to have been constructed before all the evils of modern architecture and brutalism and everything else that makes these places such depressing sinkholes. You know, I go to Canberra every year for the budget, Rowan and Rita, and as I drive down the road and as Canberra approaches, I can feel the serotonin leaking out of my brain because it's so depressing, the fact that I have to go to this horrible bubble with the horrible architecture. That is one of the things that I think is most disgraceful about a place like Canberra, is that it is utterly recession-proof. So while the rest of the country gets kicked around by coronavirus, there's no unemployment there because all the public servants are still on 120% of what ordinary people are earning for doing the same job, supporting all of the businesses there. Good for the businesses, but not so much for the rest of us because they have no clue as to what's going on in the rest of the world and in the rest of the country. That Canberra bubble is absolutely real. I would say, why couldn't you have it in Sydney? Why couldn't you have it in Melbourne? Maybe we could just have it all by Zoom meeting and save ourselves the effort.